So there's something you all need to know. I have two lifelong weaknesses in video games. If they give me a big massive world to potter around in and explore in, and a nice racing game that is a mix between the simulation level stuff of Forza and Gran Turismo, and the arcade style of your Burnouts and Need for Speeds. Therefore, whenever there's a game that scratches these two itches at the same time, I am practically compelled to buy them. Most of them are terrible, but I want to talk to you about one that was a success, and one that wanted to be more than it ever could be. I want to talk to you about two games that I found in the bargain bin trash. I want to talk to you about 2008's Fuel and 2013's The Crew. I've always had this weird thing when it comes to directions. My friends have occasionally referred to me as homing pigeon brain, and it manifests itself in an unnervingly good sense of where I have been. Put me in a city once and I'll normally remember enough to find my way around upon a return, even if it is several months or even weeks or years later. This isn't an attempt to humble brag, but I wanted you to know this quirk of my brain as it transfers over to video games as well. I love nothing more than being given a vast open world to explore in a game, and have been known to pick up any old shit if it has a halfway engaging world to muck around in. I'm looking at you, Getaway Black Monday. But I'm not going to get too much into that particular dragon that I chased this time, as I could do a whole talk on that alone. So allow me to introduce you to a largely forgotten game, 2009's Fuel. Fuel was made by Asobo Studio, who ironically went on to make Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, and published by Codemasters, and was released on the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3 and Windows in June of 2009. Before it was released, it was advertised as the largest open game world ever, a staggering 14,000 square miles of area to explore, often compared, in the pre-release material, to being the same size as the US state of Connecticut. It had one of the more unique settings I've seen for a racing game. The game world was set in a post-climate crisis collapsed United States where, and this is the part that stuck out to me even as a naive 19-year-old boy is a bit hubristic, after the collapse of society, people come together to race cars, trucks, bikes and other petrol-using vehicles in presumably one's last race-filled excess before they die off. I mean, it wasn't played with anything other than a late 2000s fuck yeah, extreme sports are cool vibe, so the whole premise of it was kind of wasted. As for the game itself, well, the driving was distinctly average. Even as one of the 6 people that will champion this game, I will be the first to admit the driving and feel of the cars and bikes and quads aren't amazing. They aren't actively bad like some games I've had the misfortune to play, and they did well enough for me to complete the game without too much swearing, which to be honest is a rarity with me in any driving game. It was the kind of definition of serviceable. There was almost no actual story to the game, the real meat and bones of the game coming from a bunch of races for you to try in bronze, silver or gold, with the main variation being the location of the race and the type of craft you raced in. As I mentioned previously, you had a choice of cars, bikes, quad bikes and trucks, with them all having a kind of Mad Max post-apocalyptic aesthetic. To play this game event to event, dealing with the average controls and rubber banding AI would be a chore, I'm not going to lie. But what really drew me to Fuel, and what kept me hanging around and playing it for far longer than it really should have had any right to, was the open world itself. The world is split into various different locations, all centered around a different kind of cool landmark or biome or ruin of the old world. From a city in the middle of a desert being retaken by the sand dunes, a giant beach container ship with the race camp set up in its shadow, a foreboding city half flooded and surrounded by reclaimed forests. The long abandoned falling apart wind turbines, the game had these really cool, really concentrated areas of interest. The game used its free mode, when you weren't actively racing in an event, to really help draw you into it. There would be trucks driving around with information on local races or collectibles that you had to drive around to find them and give them the old-fashioned burnout kind of shunt, and an early prototype of the climb up the radio / tower beacon gameplay that Ubisoft would invent around the same time in the original Assassin's Creed. There is an inherent vastness, a largeness of scale when driving from region hub to region hub in Fuel. It would take legitimate hours to cross the map, even longer if you decided to stick to the roads and dirt paths that litter the map instead of going straight in a line. It was, for one of the few and only times I experienced in video games, a game you could genuinely, legitimately get lost in. And back in 2009, I certainly did. The problem, or downside of Fuel's map, is that it was too large for no real reason. They could have made a much smaller, more condensed map that didn't have any empty, endless miles of road with almost nothing except the same identical farm buildings, or more often than that, just straight up nothing but formulaic trees. The big set pieces throughout the map are extremely thinly spread, maybe 20 places in total, and so travelling between them is a very simple gameplay task with very little to change things up other than the trackable trucks to crash into or the occasional stacked barrel of fuel. Get it? Fuel? That would add to the basic in-game currency and buy yourself crafts or clothes for your driver, which is all again extremely Rockstar energy drink vibes. But it adds something for you to tinker with, and on the more exposed bikes and quads it does have a decent cosmetic change at least. I enjoy driving along the roads, often just maxed out in one of the old school muscle cars they have in the game, listening to the early days of podcasts and Dead Can Dance. In honesty, I still look back on that time as time well spent. In a game that really kind of forgot about the whole post-apocalyptic setting that was the big draw for me, there was something truly interesting in the way that the twilight days of humanity spent in kind of a download festival way, and sadly this game never really sells itself to that big concept. It's ultimately just an excuse for stealing some post-apocalyptic look and shoving it into an otherwise generic rally game, which is a real shame. The Crew is a game that I have long thought about before I even played it. I believe I was in the bottom of a bottle or 10 when it first came out in 2014, so completely missed its launch and its DLC connected to it. I was vaguely aware of the sequel's release, but never looked into it behind a cursory, that looks like a driving game, and so completely slipped off my radar. I was first really made aware of it, or at least put it on my I'll play this someday list, when Ross over at Cursed Farms did his video on the game, and frankly, I'm probably going to hit a lot, if not many of the same points he made, so if you want to see someone who's genuinely good at this kind of content, go check out his video and his channel. I'd be an absolute liar if I didn't say he hasn't been a big influence in getting me to do this. Anyway, where was I? Right, so I got it added to my gonna play it one day list. Given it's got a map, a very distorted but still ambitious version of the entire mainland US, I knew I would find something in that game that would entertain me, even if the general consensus around it was quite poor. And given my somewhat distancing from the gaming zeitgeist due to not having the latest gen, I've slowly been working my way through these backlog of long forgotten dry spell games. And so I found myself loading up The Crew at almost the end of 2021, almost 7 years since it came out, and you know what? I fucking loved it. Now before I get into it, I'll go over the basics of the game for most of you who, like me, slept on it, or have never heard of it, or have never been interested in the Drivey Man games. I get it. But I'm here to talk to you about more than just car porn stuff, so I asked those folks to stick with us. The Crew was made by Ivory Tower, a Ubisoft studio that has made The Crew and basically nothing else. It is essentially an open world MMO driving game. Kinda. You have a large open map with mainline story missions taking you across the map city by city, and then there are looser, more individual things like challenges, events, and multiplayer races in co-op. It is also a Ubisoft game released in 2014, and so it is aggressively Ubisoft. From the secondary in-game currency that can only be bought with real world money, or the DLC cars taking up prominent spots in all the game's garages, prompting a DLC purchase with every other car, to the ubiquitous radar towers that reveal locations across the map and collectible extras for no real reason than to fill out their impressively large map. And, okay, we gotta talk about it. So this game is online only, and to be perfectly honest, I genuinely thought the servers would be down when I picked it up in 2021, but it was surprisingly still active. People were still playing. I saw other people driving around this world. How long it remains so, with the sequel being supported, I don't know, but it has that ticking clock above its head. I get why. It is basically an MMO, but I do wish and hope there was some way to get the map, if not the whole game, offline for when the servers go down. So yeah, this is a Ubi game to its very heart and bones, and some of you who have burnt out on that sort of game, I honestly can't fault you for not being able to get past this hurdle. I really don't. It was fucking everywhere when this game released, and it is still a large part of modern games, so I completely get people who just can't take more of it. If you can get past that, however, there is something lurking in the crew, which honestly made me not give a shit about the Ubi tropes. First off, and let's get this out of the way quick, like you should do in-game, is the story. It is so utterly forgettable, so mind-numbingly generic, that after the first few missions, I genuinely just started skipping all the cutscenes and limited myself to the stuff that is forced upon you during gameplay. It is a generic revenge story combined with an undercover cop story, which means that the varied and beautiful locations are mostly wasted by generic races against tough guy stereotypes, with the occasional having to save your cover or someone else's protection thrown in for good measure. Even the police chases this game sets up are laughably easy, even in the generic car you started the game with, and the only difficulty I ever had with a story mission was one of the rare raid mode missions where you have to collect crates and drive off-road, purely because it was still me at the beginning of the game, and I hadn't really fucked around to get a feel of all the off-road driving and the handling of other types of car from the street spec one I was defaulted with. But other than that, the story was very weak, very forgettable, and honestly almost not worth bothering with. But you have to bother to get through the game. You play a pretty good TM driver whose brother gets killed and you get framed for his death. Given release and a chance to rise through the ranks of the organisation your brother built, and his killer has remolded, guided by a rogue FBI agent and a team of criminals around the country. It is everything that summation suggests. Admittedly, I was aggressively apathetic about this story from pretty much the beginning, so if people find charm or interest in it, fair fucks to you. But for me, it was like watching Criminal Minds, a show that has somehow had 15 seasons despite it feeling like brain glue. I will give one suggestion though. Whenever the story in the game moves you along to a new city, you get a new waypoint to drive out to. Now, I ended up exploring all of the cities before I was taken to them by the story, but I would suggest driving to them, even if you have fast travel as an option. It ties into my main point about the crew, but it really did remain a little glimmer on an otherwise very bland storyline. So what is it exactly that interests me about the crew? Well, basically, it's the same thing as Fuel. It's the map, the world. Okay, we don't get any Mad Max vibes in this, but what we do get is Crew's greatest achievement, a scaled down, distorted version of the mainland US, with Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis, New York, Washington, Miami, New Orleans, Dallas, Las Vegas, Seattle, San Francisco, and LA. And that's just the major cities. There are also a whole host of smaller, condensed cities, little adorable squares of 3 or 4 blocks of town, trying to emulate the cities that they wanted to get into the game, but due to map compression, reduce entire metropolises down to country village status of 2 or 3 streets. That still hilariously seem to have a skyscraper or two. These cities include Salem, Newport, New Jersey, Tampa, Key West, Daytona, Palm Gate, Nashville, Chattanooga, Amarillo, Point Arthur, Point Isabel, Norfolk, Fort Stockton, Millersburg, Greenock, Monroe, Mitchell, Salt Lake City, Kingsman, Winslow, Roswell, Santa Fe, El Paso, Barstow, St. Mary, Jackson. There is just so many little places in nooks and crannies of this map. It is incredible. They're all separated by genuinely American scenery, from swamp to desert to mountaintop, and that's just on the limits of size. Driving across the map, even in a top car, will take you over half an hour, and that would be going really too fast to take in the sights. You can drive from Maine to California, from Washington State to Washington DC, from Key West to Seattle, and these all have a realistic feeling of change of scenery and landscape from point to point. The game's challenges, or skills, litter most highways and roads across the map, and driving them And just driving through them on free mode enters you into a short minute or two challenge. How fast can you go? How many slaloms will you do? Why not see how far you can jump off this conveniently placed ramp? They're all fun and simple, and even when driving from place to place, you still normally do them as a nice way to cover the distance and earn a little bit of in-game cash whilst you're at it. The game also rewards fancy driving in free mode with a Project Gotham style system for drifting, close overtaking, jumps and other chicanery, so it really does pay you to just drive around and enjoy the world that they have created, as some of the fancier models of cars can cost a lot of fake buckaroos and the missions only pay out a certain amount. The game really wants you to go out and have fun in the map, and even as the Ubisoft obligatory collectibles aren't too bad. There's a series of 242 landmarks spread across the map, with bunches of them in the large cities and some being remote parts of the map, all relating to real life history and geography. You get nothing more than a few $1,000 and some XP for each point, and a small text blurb telling you more about the landmark, but honestly, the drive out to some of these are worth that alone, and stringing together a bunch and giving yourself a virtual road trip is a legitimate choice in this game. And that's what this game does best, giving you a space to have a virtual road trip. Okay, it's not the most perfect copy of America, and lots of things didn't make the cut. Boston and Atlanta were the most noticeable absences for me, a non-American. And so for Americans, it may feel like a weird train set model of their home. But to an outsider, especially someone who has never visited their lands, I was able to fill my boots and drive my heart out across America, an honest-to-God ambition of mine, and so being able to do so in a game was a delight. I often use games as a way to relax, or just kind of be somewhere else for a while. I found this in Grand Theft Auto, driving around the map with no real aim, listening to the radio, soaking in the atmosphere. I've done this with Assassin's Creed games, Fallout games, Elite Dangerous. There are a myriad of different games that I've done this with, but none are perhaps more consolidated down to that feeling than The Crew. I've had long, lazy drives along the west coast, going from brown scrubland of South California through LA and the coastal highway before ending in green forests just before San Francisco and heading up the Pacific Northwest, the trees getting larger and larger as you head north until you're fully surrounded by redwoods and eventually hitting the lights and population of Seattle. I've spent an hour driving a stock pickup truck across desert roads and dirt paths, passing through small American southwest towns, coming across a giant thermometer at the side of the desert, or a scaled-down version of the Grand Canyon that would still feel huge due to being locked in the perspective of a car. The choice of vehicles in The Crew initially disappointed me, with only a certain amount of cars with different variations or modifications on them depending on their class. You have stock, which are just your standard road car experience, nothing fancy, but good if you want to roleplay as just a normal person. Then there's street, which fills your Need for Speed tuner style slot. Dirt covers your basic types of dirt road and off-road rally, and the next class, Perf, is kind of a top tier street racing car, more focused on power. Then you have Raid, which is essentially a souped up dirt vehicle, but it's used for the game's raid mission mode, where there is an objective to ram someone off the road burnout style before a timer expires. This game mode is a hit and miss quite literally with the AI opponents, but this is the class that provides true off-roading stats, and given a large part of the game's map is off-road and wilderness areas, it fills a slot nicely. The final class is Circuit. These versions of the cars are built like NASCAR racers and built for extreme high speed and cornering. While there is a bit too many modern supercars in the game for my tastes, they provided enough older and more interesting cars to my tastes. I said that twice, didn't I? They provided enough older and more interesting cars to my taste, such as the classic muscle cars or the BMWs or even the little Mini Cooper. The game even has several real-world racetracks tucked away in its map. Laguna Seca and the Sebring Raceway both feature, as well as several large oval tracks hidden away with a couple of fictional dirt raceways. Again, this game will rarely direct you to things like this on the map in the story mode, so it really does help with the feeling of exploration and discovery when you come across these things in the wild. In my wanderings around America, I found a shuttle launch. I found a whale and Bigfoot sightings. I found Mount Rushmore and the world's largest redwood tree, and even had time to check out the border with Mexico and the swamps of Louisiana. It is without a doubt a lesser Poundland level copy of the continental US, but still somewhere that I was happy to spend hours in, driving and exploring. I've not yet had a chance to get my hands on the sequel to The Crew, a game unsurprisingly called Crew 2. But from what I can tell from people who have played it, they sacrificed some of the map's fidelity, detail and interesting spots in order to make the game's performance run better, especially with the addition of planes and boats in the game. This means that several of the smaller towns and villages and points to potter about and exploring are gone. And I feel that is a great shame, because at its heart, The Crew manages to capture that feeling of open road and adventure, seeing where you end up. I don't know. Maybe I just have a particular hard-on for games where you get the chance to potter around and make your own fun. I guess the point I'm trying to labour to in this overlong video is that even games that are mostly trash, that are too ambitious for their time, or kneecapped by their publishers' bad habits, even games like Fuel or The Crew can contain interesting, captivating moments. And if this video has convinced any of you to give these games a try, well, I hope you enjoy the long, empty road as much as I did. Anyway, that's all I've got. Bye bye now.